I once had a sweetheart, just as good as any in his mouth. But now I'm sad and lonely, he done turned me down. I ain't got nobody, nobody cares for me. That's why I'm sad and lonely. Won't some sweet daddy take a chance with me? I'll sing sweet love songs all the time if you come and be my daddy mine. I ain't got nobody, nobody cares for me. If I only had someone that I could only call my own, for I would marry them at once and take them to my home. Every day I sigh and cry, no happiness at all I find. I have no one to love me, no one to content my mind. I ain't got nobody, nobody cares for me. That's why I'm sad and lonely. Won't some sweet daddy take a chance with me? I'll sing sweet love songs all the time if you come and be my daddy mine. I ain't got nobody, nobody cares for me.
Think of Unsolved Mysteries, Forensic Files, Columbo, Murder, She Wrote, Anne Rule, and Raymond Chandler. These stories have been long floating about in popular culture, but with the advent of podcasts and the popularity of Netflix docuseries, they have literally become part of the mainstream. The twist? The primary audience of these gory, grisly tales are women. Up to 80% of the viewing and listening audience in some cases are women. Strange? Not really. More like about time. Women's voices have often been lost in the echo chambers of victim blaming, institutionalized misogyny, and gendered violence. Karen Kilgariff, co-host of the popular podcast My Favorite Murder, notes, in all these stories that we tell and cases that we talk about, things happen for A, a reason, and B, the people that do them have histories of doing things. It's so strange that still the legal system treats these things like they're out of the blue. If a man consistently beats his wife, that will escalate. That part, sadly, is not surprising. For much of recorded history, women were viewed as chattel. They were property, their father's property first, of course, before being transferred to their husband. They were confined to their homes and didn't have the authority to file for divorce or appeal for custody rights of their children. Marital rape and spousal abuse were unheard of. The 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote was not ratified until August of 1920. Yet in the early 20th century, at a time when all of these things were still customary, Susan Glaspell created what has become a significant piece of American theater, a whodunit crime story, ripped from the headlines of her own reporting. Trifles was first performed by the Provincetown Players, a group that Glaspell herself co-founded in August of 1916. It has also been dramatized for television, staged innumerable times as a straight play, and even adapted into a chamber opera libretto. We present this short, one-act play now in the form of a radio drama coinciding with Women's History Month. As usual, the first voices you will hear are those of the men, but lean in and listen closely. Women are taking control of the narrative. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
We began in the gloomy kitchen in the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, which has been left in disarray. Unwashed pans are under the sink, a loaf of bread is outside the bread box, and a dish towel is left on the table, along with other signs of incompleted work. At the rear, Sheriff Henry Peters comes in, followed by Mr. George Henderson, the county attorney, and by Mr. Lewis Hale, a neighboring farmer. The men are all bundled up and go at once to the stove. They are followed by two women, the sheriff's wife, Mrs. Peters, a woman with a nervous face, and Mrs. Hale, who appears disturbed and looks fearfully about as she enters. The women have come in slowly and stand close together near the door. Mr. Henderson rubs his hands at the stove.
This feels good. Come to the fire, ladies.
I'm not cold.
The sheriff unbuttons his overcoat and steps away from the stove as if to mark the beginning of official business.
Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning.
By the way, has anything been moved? Are things just as you left them yesterday?
It's just the same. When it dropped below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case coming on. But I told him not to touch anything except the stove, and, you know, it's Frank.
Somebody should have been left here yesterday.
Oh, yesterday. When I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy. I want you to know, I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over everything here myself...
Well, that's enough of that. Now, Mr. Hale, tell me just what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Well, Harry and I had started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to come in with me on a party telephone. And I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe if I went to the house and spoke about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Well, let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I do want to talk about that, but tell me now just what happened when you got to the house.
I didn't hear or see nothing. I knocked at the door and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock, so I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say, come in. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door, this door, and there in that chair sat Mrs. Wright.
What was she doing?
She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked strange.
How do you mean, strange?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next, and kind of done up.
How did she seem to feel about your coming?
Well, I don't think she minded one way or other. She didn't pay much attention. I said, how do, Mrs. Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said, is it? And kind of went on pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, can't I see John? No, she says, kind of dull like. Ain't he home, says I. Yes, says she, he's home. Then why can't I see him? I asked her, out of patience. Because he's dead, says she. Dead, says I. She just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but rocking back and forth. Why, where is he? Says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here. Then I says, "Why, what did he die of?" "He died of a rope around his neck," says she, and just went on, pleating at her apron. Well, I went out. I called Harry. I thought I might need help. We went upstairs, and there he was, lying.
I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs, where you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked... but Harry, he went up to him, and he said, "No, he's dead all right, and we better not touch nothing." So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting that same way. "Has anybody been notified?" I asked. "No," says she, unconcerned. "Who did this, Mrs. Wright?" said Harry. He said it businesslike, and she stopped pleating over her apron. "I don't know," she says. "You don't know," says Harry. "No," says she. "Weren't you sleeping in bed with him?" says Harry. "Yes," says she, "but I was on the inside. Somebody slipped a rope around his neck and strangled him, and you didn't wake up," says Harry. "I didn't wake up," she said after him. And we must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be, for after a minute she said, "I sleep sound." Now Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff. So Harry went fast as he could to River's place, where there's a telephone.
And what did Miss Wright do when she knew you had gone for the coroner?
Well, she moved from that rocking chair to this one in the corner and just sat there, their hands held together, looking down. I get a feeling that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I'd come in to see if John wanted to put in a telephone. And at that, she started to laugh, and then she stopped and looked at me, scared.
Scared?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Soon Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd came, and you, and Sheriff Peters. And so I guess that's all I know that you don't.
I guess we'll go upstairs first, and then out to the barn and around there. Sheriff Peters, you're convinced there was nothing important here? Nothing that would point to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
Mr. Henderson, after again looking around the kitchen, opens the door of a cupboard closet. He gets up on a chair and looks on a shelf. He pulls his hand away. Sticky.
Here's a nice mess.
Oh, her fruit, it did freeze. She worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire'd go out and her jars would break.
Well, can you beat the woman, held for murder and roaring about her preserves?
I guess before we're through, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about.
Well, women are used to worrying over trifles.
And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies?
The women do not react. Mr. Henderson goes to the sink, takes a dipper full of water from the pail, and pouring it into a basin, washes his hands. He starts to wipe them on the roller towel, then turns it for a cleaner place. Yet he doesn't find one. He kicks his foot against the pans under the sink.
Dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
To be sure. And yet, I know there's some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels.
Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Miss Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too.
No, I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And why was that? You didn't like her?
I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson, and then
Yes?
it never seemed a very cheerful place.
No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Mr. Wright had either.
You mean they didn't get along very well?
No, I don't mean anything, but I don't think the place to be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it.
I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now.
I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does will be all right. She was taking some clothes for her. You know, and a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday.
Yeah, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters. And keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
The men go upstairs as the women look about the kitchen.
I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
She rearranges the pans under the sink which Mr. Henderson had shoved out of place.
Of course, it's no more than their duty.
Duty's all right, but I guess that deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of this on. I wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things cleaned up when she came away in such a hurry.
Mrs. Peters goes over to a small table and lifts one end of a towel that covers a pan.
She had bread set.
She was going to put this in there.
Mrs. Hale's eyes fix on the loaf of bread beside the bread box. She picks up the loaf, then abruptly drops it. She shakes her head and says in a manner of returning to familiar things.
It's a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone.
She gets up on the chair and looks in the cupboard.
I think there's some here that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Yes, here. This is cherries, too. I believe that's the only one.
She gets down, the bottle of cherries in her hand. She goes to the sink and wipes it off on the outside. She puts the bottle on the kitchen table in the center of the room.
She'll feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer.
With a sigh, she is about to sit down in the rocking chair. Before she is seated, she realizes what chair it is, and with a slow look at it, she steps back. The chair which she has touched rocks back and forth.
Well, I must get those things from the front room closet. You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them.
They go in the other room, and when they reappear, Mrs. Peters carries a dress and skirt, and Mrs. Hale follows with a pair of shoes. They put the clothes down on the kitchen table.
My, it's cold in there.
Mr. Wright was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the ladies' aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part, and then you don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take in.
She said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want, for there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose just to make her feel more natural. She said there was in the top drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And then the little shawl that always hung behind the door. Yes, here it is.
Mrs. Peters?
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
Do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit.
Mrs. Peters starts to see. Glances up to where footsteps are heard overhead in the room above.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in speech, and he'll make fun of her saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake when they was slipping that rope around his neck.
No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty, and still, they say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said coming out that what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here.
She puts her hand on the dish towel which lies on the table, stands looking down at it, one half of which is clean, the other half messy.
It's what to hear.
She makes a move as if to finish the work, then turns and looks at the loaf of bread outside the bread box. She drops the towel and says in that voice of coming back to familiar things.
I wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But, Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
I suppose it is. Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
Mrs. Hale unbuttons her coat as Mrs. Peters takes off her fur tippet, goes to hang it on hook at the back of the room, and stands looking at the underpart of a small corner table.
She was piecing a quilt.
She brings the large sewing basket, and they look at the bright pieces.
It's the log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it? Wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
Footsteps have been heard coming down the stairs. Sheriff Peters enters, followed by Mr. Hale and Mr. Henderson.
They wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up.
The men leave to go outside.
I don't know as there's anything so strange. Our taking up our time with the little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Of course they've got awfully important things on their minds.
Mrs. Hale sits down at the table and smooths out a block with decision. Mrs. Peters pulls up a chair and joins Mrs. Hale at the table. Mrs. Hale examines another block of the quilt.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one here. This is the one she was working on, and look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even, and look at this. It's all over the place. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about.
After she has said this, they look at each other, then start to glance back at the door. After an instant, Mrs. Hale had pulled at a knot and ripped the sewing.
Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
I'm just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good.
She begins threading a needle.
Bad sewing always made me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
I'll just finish up this end.
She suddenly stops and leans forward.
Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
what do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes sew awful strange when I'm just tired.
Mrs. Hale starts to say something, looks at Mrs. Peters, then goes on sewing. Mrs. Peters puts apron and other things into a bundle.
Well, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be through sooner than we think. I wonder where I can find some paper and some string.
In that cupboard, maybe.
Mrs. Peters looks in the cupboard, pulls out a bird cage and holds it up.
Why, here's a bird cage. Did you have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
Well, I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know if she took one. Maybe she did. She used to sing real pretty herself.
Seems funny to think of a bird here, but she must have had one, or why would she have a cage? I wonder what happened to it.
I suppose maybe the cat got it.
No, she didn't have a cat. She got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got in her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Strange, ain't it?
Mrs. Peters brings the cage forward and puts it on the table, examining it.
Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge is pulled apart.
Looks as if someone must have been rough with it.
Why, yes.
I wish that they were going to find any evidence they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
But I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting here all alone.
It would, wouldn't it?
She drops her sewing and looks around the room.
But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I'd come over sometimes when she was here. I wish I had.
But of course you are awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children.
I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I'd come over to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now.
Well, you mustn't reproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Sometimes we just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes less work, but it makes a quiet house. And Mr. Wright out to work all day, and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
Not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink and kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters. Just to pass the time of day with him, like a raw wind that gets your bone.
She pauses and shivers, her eye falling on the cage.
I should have think she would have wanted a bird. But what do you suppose happened to it?
I don't know, unless it got sick and died.
She reaches over and swings the broken door. Swings it again. Both women watch it.
You weren't raised round here, were you? You didn't know her?
No, not till they brought her in yesterday.
She, come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change.
Silence. Then, as if struck by a happy thought and relieved to get back to everyday things.
Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilt in with you? It might take up her mind.
Well, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it, could there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her things are in here, and her patches.
Well, here's some red. I expect this has got some sewing things in it.
They look in the sewing basket and bring out a fancy box.
What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here.
She opens the box and suddenly puts her hand to her nose. Mrs. Peters bends nearer, then turns her face away in disgust.
Oh, why, there's something wrapped up in this piece of silk.
Why, this isn't her scissors.
Mrs. Hale lifts the silk as Mrs. Peters bends closer.
Oh, Mrs. Peters,
It's the bird.
Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck. Look at its neck. It's all other side, too.
Somebody wrung its neck?
Their eyes meet. A look of growing comprehension, of horror. Steps are heard outside. Mrs. Hale slips the box under some quilt pieces and sinks into her chair. Sheriff Peters and Mr. Henderson enter. Mrs. Peters rises.
Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or knot it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting, I'm sure.
He sees the bird cage.
Has the bird flown?
Mrs. Hale puts more quilt pieces over the box.
We think the cat got it.
Is there a cat?
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave.
Mr. Henderson turns to Sheriff Peters continuing their conversation as they start back upstairs.
No sign at all of anyone coming from the outside. Their own rope. Now let's go up again and over it piece by piece. It would have to have been someone who knew just the layout of the land.
Mrs. Peters sits down. The two women sit there, not looking at one another, but as if peering into something, and at the same time holding back. When they talk now, it's in the manner of feeling their way over strange ground, as if afraid of what they are saying, but as if they cannot help but saying it.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in that pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy who took a hatchet and before my eyes, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him.
I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children around. No, Mr. Wright wouldn't like the bird, the thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too.
We don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
It was an awful thing was done in his house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him.
His neck choked the life out of him.
We don't know who killed him. We don't know.
If there had been years and years of nothing and then a bird to sing to you, it would be awful still after the bird was still.
I know what stillness is. When we homestead in Dakota and my first baby died after he was just 2 years old, and me with no other than...
How soon do you suppose they'll be through, looking for the evidence?
I know what stillness is. The law's got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?
We mustn't take on.
I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's strange, Mrs. Peters. We live close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. If I was you, I wouldn't tell her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
My, it's a good thing the men couldn't hear us when they just laugh, getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with when they just laugh.
Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't.
The men are heard coming down.
It's all perfectly clear, except the reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up this strange way of doing it.
The women's eyes meet for an instant. Mr. Hale enters from the outer door.
Well, I've got the team around. It's pretty cold out there.
I'm gonna stay here a while by myself. Sheriff Peters, you can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
Mr. Henderson goes to the table, picks up the apron, and laughs.
Oh, I guess they're not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out.
He moves a few things about, disturbing the quilt pieces which cover the box. He steps back.
No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Married to the law. Yeah. Well, I just want you to come here in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows.
Oh, windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
Mr. Hale goes outside. Sheriff Peters follows Mr. Henderson into the other room. Mrs. Hale rises, hands tight together, looking intensely at Mrs. Peters, whose eyes make a slow turn, finally meeting Mrs. Hale's. Then her own eyes point the way to where the box is concealed. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters throws back quilt pieces and tries to put the box into the bag she is wearing, but it's too big. She opens the box, starts to take the bird out, cannot touch it, and stands there helpless. The sound of a knob turning is heard in the other room. Mrs. Hale snatches the box and puts it in the pocket of her big coat. Mr. Henderson and Sheriff Peter enter the room again. Mrs. Hale keeps her hand against her pocket.
Well, Henry, at least we found out she wasn't going to quilt it. She was going to... What is it you called it, ladies?
We call it not it, Mr. Henderson.